Greetings, I am Michael Mosettig. Over the years, I've been reporting international news from Washington, London, Brussels, Cairo, Moscow, and Asian destinations for the PBS NewsHour and NBC News.
Mike, you have always been our man of the world, and whether you're here or not, you always will be, my friend.
The program's always been interested in foreign affairs, but you brought it to a new level when you joined us in 1983.
And I've been fascinated by the intersection of international media coverage and the conduct of international affairs. What is the so-called news effect? The proliferation of new media and the connectedness of the World Wide Web have made the news effect even more important in global affairs than ever before. I recently spoke on this to the press counselors and attachés from EU nations stationed in Washington, D.C. If your organization is concerned with these issues, my insights and experiences can help you understand the workings of the media as the old economic model collapses and as news organizations try to cover and confront the stories and events that define our world.
Hello, good afternoon to my press counselors, colleagues from the member states of the European Union. Thank you very much for coming here today for our monthly meeting. We have today a special guest. We have Mike Mosettig here, who is a veteran transatlantic journalist. Today we have the pleasure to have him here with us, and he can share his very long experience with us. So we are very much looking forward to what you have to tell us, that we can do our work as press counselors of the European Union member states here better in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming out on this delightful summer Washington day. Last night I had a meeting with somebody from the Singapore government, and I said, we arranged this for you so you wouldn't feel homesick coming from Singapore to Washington at this time. I don't believe, however, that given the timing of this event, that there is anybody here from either Portugal or the Czech Republic. A little bit of a conflict there. Now, as Eva's mentioned, the timing of this comes at a juncture or a change in my life and my career, going from the broadcast after all these years back into writing. But I'm here really to look forward, not backward, and really want to talk to you all about the challenges that are confronting the American news industry. And in their own way, they're as immense and unprecedented as the challenge facing all of you who work in European institutions and governments. But, I have to add a but, I cannot help but look back for just a second to the early 1960s when I began my career as a transatlantic journalist, when Europe was still riding the spirit of Jean Monnet and Messina, when the Paris Herald Tribune put its European stories under a headline saying towards the United States of Europe, when the President of the United States would stand at Philadelphia's Independence Hall on July 4th, 1962, and speak of a declaration of interdependence between the United States and Europe. The same time when big-time American news organizations like the New York Times, NBC News, were planning to open big bureaus in Brussels to cover this new phenomenon of a uniting continental Europe imminently to be joined by Great Britain and other countries. Now, how long ago and far away that seems today, not only from your perspective as European diplomats, but mine as American journalists. And I have no intention here of reviewing 4 decades of history, and indeed I'm going to fast forward to now and raise the question whether in decades ahead, whether historians who are trying to make sense of a second consecutive century born in violence, as the United States has commenced wars in places almost totally unknown to most of the American public, where was the institution that in the past had served the role for the American people of explainer, educator, translator. And obviously I'm talking about the American press, both print and broadcast. And unfortunately, the answer to that question is increasingly missing in action. Because, coincidental with the American engagement in new and dangerous places, has been the retreat of a good part of the American press, largely for economics, reasons of economics. Long before the meltdown on Wall Street, there was a meltdown in American journalism. The economic model of mass audiences that attracted humongous revenues from advertising, derived from largely being in monopoly or near monopoly situations, has vanished. And there are several factors involved here. Technology, you've heard a lot about, that's only one of them, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, the first piece I want to mention is sociology. When you think of just how much United States society has changed its living habits since the heyday of the old media, which I sort of characterized between the 1950s up to the early 1990s, the time when I started as a copy boy on the old Washington Evening Star, back when Eisenhower was president. In Washington, we had 2 afternoon and 1 morning newspaper. We had 4 over-the-air broadcast television stations, 3 affiliated with the networks, magazines such as Life, Look, the Saturday Evening Post, and news weeklies such as Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News. But when you think of the society that was sustaining that kind of followership, a family in which usually only one spouse was working, commutes on streetcars or buses that may have lasted at most a half an hour, children whose after-school activities were usually conducted within shouting distance of their home or school, family dinners around a television set that coincided with evening news at 6 or 6:30. And those programs, the ones went to a half an hour in 1963. When you look at the United States today, with the possible exception of New York City, I doubt if anyone here knows of a single family in the United States that now lives under such circumstances. And during what I refer to as a heyday, but not meaning to be over-romanticized, this period, the news organizations, which are making a lot of money, big profits, did turn over a lot of that revenue to sustaining and increasing their overseas coverage, creating more foreign bureaus, sending increasingly well-trained journalists to cover countries and continents. Now, the second piece I want to mention is what I call the political piece. For the most part, the journalistic model for those organizations was unique in the world and even in the history of this country. Throughout most of journalism, of recorded journalism, even in this country, news outlets were traditionally associated with one political party or one ideology and gave voice to that form of politics. What happened here was a unique experiment that began in the late 19th century to practice journalism independent of political parties. Now, in the United States, American journalistic lexicon, the word that was used to describe this was objectivity. Now, that you can argue whether is a humanly possible condition. And now, of course, in the age of Fox, words like fair and balanced take on their own meaning. So I stick with the term nonpartisan. And that model started coming under attack, or you could argue even started falling apart in the 1960s. And I pinpoint a certain moment. I happened to be covering it when former President Eisenhower was speaking at the 1964 Republican Convention. And in his speech, he had one throwaway line, and speechwriters love alliteration, and he referred to sensation-seeking columnists and commentators. And he was about ready to go on with the rest of his speech, and instead the whole convention floor erupted in this huge outburst of applause and roaring approval, a signal that the Republican Party about ready to nominate Barry Goldwater, was changing its face forever. But as it turned out, Ike was about 50 years ahead of the curve. As a historian friend of mine remarked the other day, if Eisenhower turned on cable television today, he would see nothing but sensation-seeking columnists and commentators. And indeed, the cable audiences, if not necessarily all the practitioners, now pretty well divide into left, right, and center-left. This division is even more intense among websites. You look at Drudge on one side, Huffington on the other. You're not necessarily even talking about two different presentations of news. You're talking about two different universes of what constitutes news. So in the relatively short period of time, a couple of decades, we've gone from a fairly circumscribed collection of national news organizations, the wire services, the networks, 2 or 3 national newspapers that largely offered a common definition and a common gatekeeper of what was news for the entire country. Now, as you see all the time, this has proliferated into a mass of a la carte news, opinion of every stripe, and persuasion. And then, of course, there is, making a lot of this possible, the new technology. We talk about the internet. 2 events sort of happened simultaneously. The internet came more widely on the scene in the mid to late 90s. And at the same time, without much foresight, and now I would imagine much regret, newspapers decided to offer their main product on the internet for free. And that paralleled the demise of newspapers. Now, you can argue back and forth about the internet, but I think the basic points are pretty clear. It's a much more efficient way to deliver news. Trees don't die, ink isn't spread, and most importantly, consumers of news can consume the news on their schedule, not on the schedule of the news providers who used to provide the bulk of news either at 6 o'clock in the morning or at 6 o'clock in the evening, and not a lot in between. Nowadays, 24 hours available on a keystroke. But if you talk to people of what I would describe as the internet generation, which is a goodly number of you in the front row, and you ask where you get your news, they would often say, we get it from the internet. We don't get it from conventional mainstream media. But if you press them further, you will find out that indeed they are getting their news from conventional mainstream media. It's just getting delivered by a different tool. Most of the websites that people go to for news are old line news organizations, and they are still bearing the cost of hiring reporters, hiring editors to turn out a polished news product. But the downside of this is, again, a lot of their subscribers don't pay anything. And the extent to which they are getting advertisers moving over from conventional media, they are paying a lot less to be on to advertise on a website than they certainly would pay to buy a full page in the New York Times or the Washington Post, or to buy 60 or 30 seconds of airtime on a network. So as a financial deal, that's great for the consumer, anything but great for the providers, and that's why you keep seeing these increasingly bad revenue and profit numbers coming out for mainline news organizations. And then, of course, there's the question, what does this mean for the civic society? And I think we can argue maybe not a good deal at all. All you have to do is go back to the last presidential campaign, see that the internet is not necessarily a new form of communication, but a tool or a pathway. And what goes on to the internet, an expression I like to use, can become the equivalent of throwing spaghetti up against the wall and seeing what sticks. We are not, on a lot of internet sites, not the conventional ones, but a lot of the other ones, talking not about a process of reporting, checking, editing news, separating fact from rumor. But as I said, these organizations have been financially decimated. And as their old model comes crashing down around them, the reaction of most mainstream news organizations has been to cut costs. And often, or more often than not, the first casualty has been overseas coverage. Papers like the Boston Globe, Baltimore Sun, which used to maintain a few news bureaus around the world, magazines like Time, Newsweek, the networks, they've all shredded their foreign bureaus. On the fingers now of barely two hands, you can count the number of American news organizations that have maintained their journalistic and financial commitment to overseas coverage. The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, AP, National Public Radio, CNN, Fox. At the NewsHour, we've never had foreign bureaus. We just send correspondents overseas from time to time. Now, obviously, we are too close to give assessments of what this means for the political decision-making process, how things happen and how things are getting decided in this republic. But you look at the evidence of the coverage, look at Iraq after the first couple of years of that war. You had to search pretty far and wide to get much coverage, see much coverage on television. Not a great deal of difference in Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, there are probably fewer American correspondents based in Afghanistan than there ever were in Iraq. And then you look at these countries that the rising ascendant powers, China, India, and Brazil, for example, coverage is pretty sporadic in all but a very few news organizations. And you know, Americans have a lot of stake in what happens in this place, particularly if particularly if a country like China decides it's no longer in their interest to buy American Treasury bonds. And Mexico, which is right next door, when you think of all the civic strife that's going on in Mexico with the drug war and how little coverage that's getting in the United States. But on the other side of the coin, for the audience that's considered the devoted news followers, the internationalist audience here in the United States, and the Pew Research Group, Andy Kohut's group, estimates that that's about 12% of the overall news audience. They follow, you know, a major newspaper, probably listen to NPR, watch us, read one or two magazines a week. For them, there are two ways to go in terms, because if they can't get what they need from, if they live in Philadelphia or Boston or whatever, they can't get that kind of news from their local paper, and certainly not going to get it from their local television station. The Times is becoming more national. The Wall Street Journal is becoming more national. And then if you want to dig a layer deeper, you can go to The Economist or the Financial Times. And also the internet. I mean, in a peculiar way, the internet plays the role of villain, but there's another role that it plays here for people who have the time. And I always say that the only problem for the person who invented the internet didn't invent the 26-hour day. At the same time, there's an immense trove of sources that you can go to. And for an American audience, even a lot of them are in English, whether you're talking about newspapers in Asia or news organizations in Europe, for example, you know, the Spiegel English language service, or Aretz in the Middle East. So you have on this side a widening rather than a narrowing of potential sources to get information. And of course, they are no longer all American-based with an American orientation or perspective on the news. It opens up, for particularly media scholars and people like that, a whole new range of debate about what is available to people and at what level. So where does this leave us all? I like to think of myself as a realist, but not a pessimist. And I'm certainly not ready at this stage of the game to fall into or offer only counsels of despair, as gloomy as it sometimes seems. As I mentioned, out there is still an audience for a serious product. And I maintain the hope, I hope it's not a delusional hope, that out there in Silicon Valley or elsewhere, there are people who are trying to figure out how to marry this need and desire for solid news product to the new technology that's out there. And then the third part of the trick is how to make it all profitable. Because the internet at the moment is not profitable. So for me, that's summed up in the mythical character that I have named Mark William Randolph Hearst Zuckerberg. And of course, we're in it in our way, and you all are in it in your way. It's certainly those of you who are directly tied to the enterprise that's called Europe. These days, especially from a daily diet of the FT op-ed page, you can wake up thinking every morning that there are no lights at the end of the tunnel. And none of us in this room can or should underestimate the challenges that lay ahead for Europe. And certainly those of you in public affairs, in your discussions with American journalists, should not sugarcoat or spin the risks and perils that lay ahead. But strangely enough, inspiration does come from curious places. A few weeks ago, I received an invitation from you all to attend a Kennedy Center concert by the European Youth Orchestra. I thought, well, fine. Sunday afternoon, pleasant way to spend a day. Listen to them as they trot out the old war horses of Mozart and Beethoven, and a couple hours you go back home. But what transpired instead was one of the most exciting concerts I've ever heard. There was challenging music, both modern and old, played with considerable talent and great gusto by young musicians from 27 different European countries, all thrown together sort of like an all-star baseball team or football team here in America, and led with great skill by Vladimir Ashkenazy. So at least in the music front, the European spirit does indeed endure, sustain itself, go forward with great vigor, idealism, and enthusiasm. And during one piece, Pinchas Zuckerman, the noted violinist, was playing Bruch's first violin concerto. And this is really sublime music. And somewhere in the midst of that, my mind sort of wandered a bit. And I was looking up there, listening and looking up there and thinking, all that this guy is holding on his left shoulder are a bunch of bits of wood and glue and string. And in your hands or mine, they would still be wood, glue, and string. But somehow in his hands, they became something remarkable and transporting. And you watch and listen to that, and you think, well, anything's possible. And so for Americans of sort of my age and time, those of us who were influenced in large measure, for better or for worse, by the Kennedy era. And during Robert Kennedy's 1968 campaign, which I covered some, when it was a time to signal the reporters to get back on the bus, he would either start quoting to the audience lines from George Bernard Shaw or lines that generations of English-speaking students have learned. He would quote from Tennyson's Ulysses, which remains appropriate to this day. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off and sitting well in order smite the sounding furrows, for our purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the bath of the western stars before I die. Perhaps we shall reach the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we know. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are no longer that great strength which in days of yore moved heaven and earth, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic heart, perhaps made weak by time and fate, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.